As we look at Psalm 83, I've entitled this psalm, Be Not Silent, Be Not Still, O God. You'll see that in the very first verse, the psalmist makes this request of God. He says, Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. There are times in our lives when God seems to be silent. There are times in our lives when God seems to be still. We would like for Him to say something. We would like for Him to do something. We would like for Him somehow to get involved in the events of our lives, but He doesn't seem to be. He seems to be standing off. And so the psalmist, in a very direct way, calls upon God to arise, calls upon God to step forth and say something and do something on behalf of His people. Now, we may somehow look at this and think of this as being a little bit presumptuous to call God forth and to call God to act. But I don't know that we ought to look at it that way. Maybe that's why God sometimes does stand off. Maybe that's sometimes why God doesn't say or do things that we want Him to do, is because we don't come out directly and ask Him to. If you look at this from the standpoint of a father, I think most fathers like for their children to ask them to do things. It isn't that the father doesn't want to do them. It isn't that the father isn't ready to do them. But it is a wonderful thing as a father to have your child ask you to do something, to request that from you. And God is a God who does not want to interfere in our lives. He doesn't try to interfere in our lives. He does not try to force His will upon us. He certainly wants us to obey Him and serve Him and live for Him, and yet He honors our free will. He doesn't force us to do anything. He wants us to do it out of love. He wants us to do it out of fear and reverence for Him, and not because we have to. And so I think that there is the proper time for us to do as the psalmist is doing here, and asking God to act, asking God to speak, asking God to do what needs to be done in various situations. I think God, as a loving Father, is honored when His children approach Him, believing that He will respond, believing that He will act on their behalf. And so that's what the psalmist is doing. As we look at an outline for this psalm, in the first 8 verses we see the enemies of God. And the psalmist is going to outline these enemies. Then in verses 9 through 12 we see the exploits of God. We see the things that God has done in times past on behalf of His people. Amazing, wonderful things. And then in the final verses, in verses 12 through our verses 13 through 18 it should be, we see the excellency of God. We see how great God really is. And we see that the events of this psalm and the events of other situations have all been designed to give God the glory and the honor that He deserves. To let the earth know that God truly does sit above the earth, that God rules in the kingdoms of men, and that He is the one and only God. We'll see that by the time we get to the end of the psalm. But let's begin by noticing the enemies of God, beginning in verse 1 of Psalm 83. Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. Notice that the psalmist refers to them as God's enemies. He says, thine enemies. Now it is true that they are Asaph's enemies. They are the enemies of God's people. But notice how the psalmist very directly says, God, they are your enemies. We have to keep in mind as we go through this psalm that Asaph is not asking God to merely act on his behalf, but rather he's asking God to act on his own behalf. He's asking God to do this because God's name is at stake here. God's reputation, God's proper place among men is at stake here. And so by the time we get to the end of the psalm, we're going to see that Asaph has not been asking this from a selfish, personal standpoint. Although he's clearly involved in what happens has an effect upon him, but rather he's asking for the sake of God that these things be done. And certainly when we pray, that's the spirit in which we pray. We ask for God's will to be done. We ask for God to do that which is best for His cause, and not always necessarily what is best for us. He says, For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. In other words, God, they are rising up against you. They are very proudly lifting up their heads against you. Now notice as he moves to the next verse, he says, They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. Verse 2, he says, they're your enemies. In verse 3, he says they're our enemies. Now, I think there's the proper order there. I think they're the proper orders that first and foremost they're your enemies. And then they're our enemies because of our relationship with you. Because we serve you, they are our enemies also. You see, you cannot separate God from His people. We've talked about it before. You can't separate Christ in the church. Jesus very clearly explained that His people would be hated because the world hated Him. In John chapter 15 and verse 18, He tells His disciples not to be amazed by this, if the world hate them, for they first hated Him. He tells them in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 13 that, again, don't be amazed if you're hated. You're hated because of your association with me, Jesus says. Because you claim to be my followers, you're hated. If we think about the fact that the devil is behind the hatred that is exhibited against God's people, what the devil cannot do against God, he seeks to do against God's people. He seeks to attack those that he can attack. He seeks to undermine those that he can undermine. He seeks to hurt God through hurting God's children. That's the way he goes about it. Now, that's a cowardly way to do it. That's a ruthless way to do it. But nonetheless, that's what he does. He can't lay siege directly against God. And so what he does is he attacks the people of God. And through that, he attacks God. He could not make havoc of God in Acts chapter 8, but he could make havoc of the church. He could not stop Christ from rising from the dead, but he could try to bury Christianity. That's what he's seeking to do. We see how he acts. We see how he moves in hatred against God's people. Now look at this list as we move down through here. He says, they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. And in the Old Testament, if you know your Old Testament history, then you know that the Israelites had a number of enemies. They had a number of individuals who wanted to destroy them as a nation, to completely wipe them off of the face of the earth. And yet God preserved them, not because they were mightier than the people around them, but because they were His people and He loved them, and so He preserved them. The glory went to God and not to Israel for their military might. God prohibited them from having certain weapons of war that those around them had. God prohibited that because God wanted them to trust in Him and not to trust in those weapons of war. Notice in verse 5, for they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. Notice again, he brings it back to God. They're your enemies. They're our enemies. They are confederate. They have formed a confederation against you. They are determined to wipe your people off the face of the earth. That's the way they're getting at you. That's the way they're attacking you. God, this confederation is against you ultimately. Now notice he says, beginning in verse 6, the tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagarenes, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also is joined with them. They have holpen, the children of Lot, Selah. Now as we think about these nations that are named, what stands out about these nations? At least many of them are what? They're kin to them. Okay, very good. They're kin folks. Very good. You look down through this list, take a look at the names. Edom. They have an association with the Israelites, right? These are the descendants of Esau. Remember Jacob and Esau? These are descendants. These are relatives of God's people. Notice as well, the Ishmaelites. You remember Ishmael, right? You remember how that Abraham became frustrated in waiting on God. He sought to go about through the agency of Sarah. Sarah was very much involved in this as well, although she probably would not have claimed it after the fact. She was involved in the front end of producing a child through her handmaiden. The Ishmaelites came as a result of that. They were enemies of God's people throughout Old Testament history. There's a great strife and animosity between Sarah and Hagar, and then between Isaac and Ishmael, and from that time there has been that between their descendants. But there's a connection here. What about Moab? Lot, tied into Lot, right? You remember Lot and his two daughters? The two daughters were of the misconception in many ways, but the main misconception was that their father was the last man alive on the earth. And so if they were ever going to have children, they were going to have children through him. And so they hatched this scheme whereby they got him drunken, and then they went in unto him, and they produced seed from him. And the two descendants were Moab and Ammon. And from them came the Moabites and the Ammonites, who became sworn enemies of God's people, among the cruelest and most bothersome enemies that God's people had, the Moabites and the Ammonites. And then we have the Hagarenes. Most suggest that they have some kind of a connection to Hagar, much like the Ishmaelites, a connection somehow, and maybe through someone else. That fathered a child. We don't know the full story. The Bible doesn't tell us that story. But there may have been a connection as well with these individuals. Gebal, don't know who that was. Ammon, we've already associated with Lot. Amalek, there are a couple of different Amaleks mentioned in the Old Testament. We can't be exactly sure which one that one is. There was an Amalek that goes all the way back to the time of Abraham, and it may very well have been that Amalek that's under consideration here. We have the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. The Philistines, of course, were constant enemies of Saul and Israel. We know that history. And so when we look at this list, the thing that stands out about this is that many of these enemies that have formed this confederation against God's people have a kinship to them. This is in some senses a civil war that is being waged against them. Nothing civil about it. But if you think about what the Bible says, so often our enemies come from what source? From one's own household, right? That's what Jesus says. From one's own household, Matthew chapter 10 and verse 36. And these are from one's own household. This is from Jacob. This is from Isaac's family. This is from Abraham. From Ishmael to Esau to Lot. When we think about all those connections tied in there, these all have ties. And yet they are the enemies. And it seems as if that Lot's descendants were among the instigators of this. Notice in verse 8, Asher also is joined with them. They have holpen the children of Lot. The children of Lot would be Moab and Ammon. They seem to have been most involved in this, and they evidently formed this confederation. They got these other nations involved because they weren't strong enough of their own to destroy them, to wipe them off the face of the earth. And so they get others involved, including nations that have no connection whatsoever to the family. They get outsiders involved in this as well. Now when we think about the ugliness of this, we think first of all the ugliness of brethren fighting, of those who have a kinship fighting. But then we think of the utter ugliness, the greater ugliness of the fact that those who are fighting would then involve outsiders in this fight. That seems to be what happened. It is an ugly thing today when churches fight, when brethren are at odds one with another, but it becomes uglier when outsiders, those who are not brethren, are involved within the fight and brought into the fight. That's the reason why Paul talks about going to law with your brother and some of the other situations in the New Testament, because of the shame that would be involved in that kind of a situation. But here we have these enemies. And they're not only the enemies of Asaph and of Israel, but they're the enemies of God. He so identifies them. He's asking God to act on their behalf. Now, we understand you cannot attack God's people without attacking God. You cannot attack God without attacking God's people. They're tied together. When God's people are attacked, God's going to come to their defense. And when God is attacked, God's people are going to come to His defense. That's the way it is. We're linked together, the way it ought to be and the way it is within this psalm. We see that in the New Testament regarding the church. Saul made havoc of the church, but Jesus said, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? To persecute the church was to, in fact, persecute Christ. Now let's talk about the exploits of God. Let's talk about the great things that God had done in days gone by. Now, the Old Testament was written, according to Romans 15 and verse 4, for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And so when we read through the Old Testament and we read the things that God did on behalf of His people, that is designed to give us patience. It is designed to give us comfort. It is designed to give us patience for us to weather the storms that we face. For us to have the realization God has always taken care of His people. God has always looked after those that are His. We have all of these stories in the Old Testament, all of these occasions in the Old Testament where God acted on behalf of His people. And so I can have the confidence today that God loves me as He loved them. That as God acted for them, He'll act for me. It's not to say that God's going to work a miracle today. We're not asking God to do that. But we are saying that we can draw great patience and great comfort from the fact that God has loved His people and has protected them down through history. And we believe that He can and will do that providentially for us today. So there's great comfort in this. And Asaph is moving from what these enemies are doing, but then he's going to call to mind all the things that God has done before, with a firm belief that God will yet act on behalf of His people. He's confused. God's silent. He wants God to move. He wants God to act. But he reminds himself that God has been a God that has been there for His people. Notice in verse 9, he says, "Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin at the brook of Kison, which perished at Endor. They became as dung for the earth. Make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeb, yea, all their princes as Zebah and Zalmunna, who said, Let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession." This is a recounting of this Old Testament history, maybe some history that we don't remember all that well. But the Israelites would have remembered it. These were powerful enemies that came up against them. These were strong confederacies that formed against them. And yet God overthrew them. His people survived them. And so you understand why Asaph brings up these particular situations, because they are the comparisons that he needs. These are also strong confederacies that were broken. And he believes that this confederacy that they're now facing can be broken as well. We want to notice some of these Old Testament examples. Go to Numbers chapter 31. Numbers chapter 31. We kind of talked about this on Sunday when we referenced Balaam and what happened to Balaam. We'll call it back to mind tonight. Numbers 31 and verse 8. It's interesting when you work at Bible classes and lessons, you don't necessarily work them up to go together. There are connections that occur, and this is one of those connections. Numbers 31 and verse 8, it says, "And they slew the kings of Midian, beside the rest of them that were slain, namely Evi, and Rechem, and Zur, and Hur, and Reba, 5 kings of Midian. Balaam also the son of Beor, they slew with the sword." So these 5 kings, they overcame. They slew those 5 kings. This is a strong confederacy. When you have 5 kings who have come together to wage war against one common enemy. Generally speaking, you can't get 5 kings to do this, because there's concern on the behalf of the kings. Okay, when we win, who gets what? And usually they can't be satisfied that when the battle is won that they will get their proper portion. They are very concerned that we're giving more men to the cause. We're putting more into the cause, and yet we're not getting more out of the cause. And so it's hard to get 5 kings who are used to having absolute authority to share authority with another king. But they form this confederacy, and they come against God's people, and yet they are defeated. And Balaam's right in the middle of them. Here's the one who said, "I can't go, God won't let me go." Here's the one that said, "Even if you give me a house full of gold and silver, I can't go and do this." And yet, when the story is ended, he's right in the middle of them. He's killed in the middle of these 5 kings. He's in one of the highest positions he could possibly be among these pagan people. He's tried to curse God's people, couldn't do that, but he found another way through the immorality to destroy God's people. And, of course, the Bible records that. Judges chapter 7. Judges chapter 7. Notice another accounting of the history that we're talking about over here. We have the same names that are mentioned, but so that you have a little bit of this history, very quickly let's read through the context so that I can call to mind what took place. Make sure I've got the right passage, yes. It says, and 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Bethshittah and Zereath, and to the border of Abel-Meholah, unto Tabbath. And the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali, and out of Asher, and out of all of Manasseh, and pursued after the Midianites. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all Mount Ephraim, saying, Come down against the Midianites, and take before them to the waters of Bethbara and Jordan. And then all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together, and took the waters unto Bethbara and Jordan. And they took 2 princes of the Midianites, Orb and Zeb, and they slew Orb upon the rock Orb, and Zeb they slew at the winepress of Zeb. And they pursued Midian, and brought the heads of Orb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of Jordan. Here are these 2 great princes. And guess where these 2 great princes run to when the battle turns against them? They run back home. One runs back to the rock that bears his name evidently. The other one runs back to the winepress. They go back to places that are familiar to them, and they're slain in those very places. If you think about the war in Iraq and Saddam Hussein, if you know anything about that story, extremely interesting because he connected himself to so much of biblical history, even in an attempt to rebuild Babylon and some of the things that he was trying to do. But when he was finally caught and killed, do you remember where he was caught? He went back to a place where he had earlier escaped capture. He went back to a childhood place. And that's where he ultimately was discovered, kind of like these princes, running back to a place that he considers to be safe, where he believes people will protect him and look out for him. And of course, he ultimately met the same end that they did. In Judges chapter 4, beginning in verse 15, we have some of these other names that are called up. It says, And the Lord discomfited Sisera and all of his chariots and all his host with the edge of the sword before Barak, so that Sisera lighted down off his chariot and fled away on foot. Now, any time that you leave your chariot and go to your feet to get away, the enemy is pressing you pretty hard. In order for you to get, we've all watched the police chases on television. Whenever they discard the car and start running on foot, you know it's just about over. They've gone about as far as they can go. Well, here is Sisera. He's gone about as far as he can go. He can't go anymore on chariot. He abandons it. Verse 16, But Barak pursued after the chariots and after the host unto Harosheth of the Gentiles, and all the host of Syria fell upon the edge of the sword, and there was not a man left. Now it seems as if, gathering from the information we have here, that somehow Sisera disappears. He lets the chariots press on ahead. He's thinking they're going to pursue the chariots. He's going to get away. And it appears that way for a time. Verse 17, Howbeit Sisera fled away on his feet to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael went out to meet Sisera, and said unto him, Turn in, my lord, turn in to me, fear not. And when he had turned in unto her in the tent, she covered him with a mantle. And he said unto her, Give me, I pray thee, a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. And she opened a bottle of milk, and gave him drink, and covered him. Again he said unto her, Stand in the door of the tent, and it shall be, when any man doth come and inquire of thee, and say, Is there any man here? That thou shalt say, No. Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a nail of the tent, took a hammer in her hand, and went softly unto him, and smote the nail into his temples, and fastened it unto the ground. For he was fast asleep and weary, so he died. And behold, as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him, and said unto him, Come, and I will show thee the man whom thou seekest. And when he came in into her tent, behold, Sisera lay dead, and the nail was in his temples. So God subdued on that day Jabin the king of Canaan before the children of Israel. And the hand of the children of Israel prospered, and prevailed against Jabin the king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin king of Canaan. Here are the enemies of God. Here are those that have formed an alliance against His people. And they're being hunted down and killed one by one. Notice Judges 5 and verse 21. Judges 5 and verse 21. It says, The river of Kishon, remember we read about that, swept them away. That ancient river, the river Kishon. O my soul, thou hast trodden downstream. It's sweeping them away. They get caught in the river. And the river becomes an instrument of God in carrying out God's vengeance against them. Notice chapter 8, Judges chapter 8. More of this history. And again, Asaph is in large measure the historical psalmist. He's bringing all this history to bear. And chapter 8 and verse 12. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued after them and took the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and discomfited all of the host. And Gideon the son of Joash returned from battle before the sun was up, and caught a young man of the men of Succoth, and inquired of him. And he described unto him the princes of Succoth, and the elders thereof, even 70 men. And he came unto the men of Succoth, and said, Behold Zebah and Zalmunna, with whom ye did upbraid me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in thine hand, that we should give bread unto thy men that are weary? I want you to understand what's going on. These people of this city have been taunting them. You're not winning the battle because you don't have these 2 kings in your hands. And until you have these 2 kings in your hands, you haven't won. They're still going to defeat you. They're going to overcome you. We're not going to help you. Verse 16, and he took the elders of the city and the thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. He taught them a lesson through these briars and thorns, that they ought to better choose their alliances. It says in verse 17, and he beat down the tower of Peniel, and slew the men of the city. Then said he unto Zebah and Zalmunna, What manner of men were they whom ye slew at Tabor? And they answered, Art as thou art, so were they. Each one resembled the children of a king. And he said, They were my brethren, even the sons of my mother, as the Lord liveth. If you had saved them alive, I would not slay you. And he said unto Jether, his firstborn, Up and slay them. But the youth drew not his sword, for he feared, because he was yet a youth. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, Rise thou and fall upon us. For as the man is, so is his strength. And Gideon arose and slew Zebah and Zalmunna, and took away the ornaments that were on their camels' necks. Here is these enemies of God being wiped away one by one. Now, notice that Asaph understands that God was responsible for those victories. He understands that God accomplished it through His people, but he does not give Barak, he doesn't give any of these other men, he doesn't name Jael, he doesn't name any of these people as being the ones that gained the victories. But rather he simply said that God did all of this. And he's asking God to do this time as God had done on so many occasions before. When you think about the Old Testament, how is God identified over and over again? As the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Is God still the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Absolutely. In fact, that's the point that Jesus was making. It wasn't. It's the fact that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still living somewhere. He remains their God today. Now, the point here is the fact that what God has done on behalf of His people in times gone past, in times gone by, still reminds us of how much He loves us and cares for us and will protect us and help us today. We can rely on that, just as they did. Now notice as we continue down through the context that we want to talk about the excellency of God in Psalm 83, and that begins in verse 13. It says, O my God, make them like a wheel, as the stubble before the wind. Make them like a wheel. There are different interpretations of this. Most believe that this literally means make them like the dust. And the idea is this. As the chariot wheels or as various wheels roll down the road, they throw up the dust which gets blown away by the wind. And so it's literally like dust in the wind. That's the idea here. Blow them away like the dust. I remember when we lived in Walnut, Mississippi, which is very rural, if it wasn't a state road, it was a dirt road. And in the summertime, cars would fly up and down those dirt roads, and it seemed like it took 5 minutes for the dust to settle. And on the side of the roads, from head high down, they were covered with dust. And it was a hard place to live because of that dust. But there's the idea of this dust being stirred up, it being blown about, being blown away. That's what he's asking. The images here are very, very graphic. They're images that you can see and understand. As the stubble before the wind. The idea is the chaff of the weed or some other stubble that just gets blown around. Have you ever lost, let's say, for example, one of the little plastic bags you get at Walmart, and it got caught in the wind and you were trying to catch it? Have you ever tried to do that? You know what I'm talking about? Extremely hard to catch, isn't it? Because the wind just keeps blowing. Every time you think I'm getting close, I'm going to finally get it, it blows it again. He's saying literally for God to blow them away in that same sense, to blow them out of the country where they're become a threat. He says, as the fire burneth the wood, and as the flame setteth the mountains on fire. The background of this is, before they could plant their crops, they had to get rid of the thorny bushes and things that came up. And so what they would do is they would get a windy day, they would set it on fire, and literally allow the fire to sweep across the field, burning all of that up, and then they could go back and plow it. That's the image here. He's asking God to act in that way. He says, so persecute them with thy tempest, and make them afraid with thy storm. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord. And we have occasions in the Bible where those who were enemies of God's people, eventually, because of the shame that they felt at defeat, acknowledged God. A good example of that is in Daniel chapter 4 with Nebuchadnezzar, who acknowledges God by the end of that account. And he even encourages the people of his land to worship the God that Daniel serves because of that. There are other occasions, but that's a good occasion to kind of show you that taking place. He says as well in verse 17, let them be confounded and troubled forever. Yea, let them be put to shame and perish, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the Most High over all the earth. The reason for all of this is so that men might know that God is Jehovah. That God is the one and only God, that He rules over the earth. There's no one else like unto Him. Daniel chapter 4, we don't have time to notice all of these verses, but Daniel chapter 4, we've already referenced it. And so let's turn over there for just a minute and take a look at what the proud man Nebuchadnezzar had to learn. You remember he talked about building Babylon by his power and all the things that he had done. And God caused him to graze like an ox in the field, and his hair grew like eagle's feathers, and his fingernails like bird's claws. He was cut off from his kingdom for a season. And I believe, had it not been for the providential care of God, he would have lost his kingdom. But God somehow kept the kingdom within His control during this period when he could not rule. But in Daniel 4 and verse 25, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling place shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever He will. All of these things were done to him so that he could know that God was in control. He wasn't. Later on in this context we have the same. Notice in verse 32, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever He will. And that's what Asaph is asking for God to do. He's asking for God to act so that the pagan people can know that God is in control, that God's in charge, that God rules in the kingdoms of men, that He alone is Jehovah. There's no one like unto Him. And I want to encourage you as we look toward the future and as we look to the things that may come in our own nation, the things that may happen. I think this is a prayer that probably we ought to keep in mind as well. That when we begin to pray, that we ask God to declare to the world that the God that our nation used to acknowledge, the God that our nation used to trust, is the one and only God. And to vindicate that idea before the world. And that's not so much God asking Him to do it on our behalf, because we as a nation will not be deserving of it. But it's asking Him to do it on His behalf, so that the world knows that He is God and not Allah. That He's God and not the pagan gods of the world. That's what our prayer needs to be, is that the world would be brought into the realization that there is but one and only one God, and that God is the God that we read about in the Bible, that we read about in the Holy Scriptures and not in some other book of man. Thank you very much for your